Hello and welcome to GameSack. Check it out, I'm a 16-bit 3D polygon. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting to take a look at some titles that attempted 3D gameplay using polygons in the 16-bit era. None of these consoles were designed to do this, so it's definitely pushing hardware limits. Plus, it's interesting to see what types of games came out back then that, wanted to be 3D. Let's start with one that was only released in Japan. Let's start with Star Cruiser on the Genesis. Well, actually the Mega Drive, since it was never released outside of Japan on the console. This was one of the very first polygonal efforts for the system, and it's a port of a game that was designed for Japanese home computers like the X68000. Fortunately, this was translated into English by fans so that we can fully enjoy it. Most of the game takes place using a first-person perspective, and as a result, the world is built using polygons. Yeah, they look pretty rough, mainly due to the weird textures that they chose, but you get used to it soon enough. This is a science fiction adventure game / dungeon crawler. You first go to an enemy base to steal the Star Cruiser ship, and then you go to other enemy bases to rescue people, steal parts, and whatnot. In the space stations, you'll often need to find keys to unlock doors to the next segment. I recommend saving a lot in these areas because it can be easy to die. Even the town that you roam around in, if you can call it a town, is rendered completely with polygons. Wow, this is the future! And you'd be right if you actually said that back then. There's even some space flight along with dogfighting here and there, but you can often skip that by warping to a location. The frame rate can be pretty dismal, as you might expect, ranging anywhere from 3 to just over 8 frames per second. But the polygonal area takes up a surprisingly large portion of the screen. The 2D conversation graphics are good, and the music is often fantastic. Overall, this game is great fun, and it's a true shame that it didn't get an international release in its own time. I think people would have loved it. Hard Drive-In from Sterling Silver Software and Tangen was one of the first games on the Genesis to use polygons. It was released on the same day as Star Cruiser in Japan. This is a port of the arcade racing game that promised to simulate real 3D driving physics. And this is only a 2 megabit cartridge, which is quite small, even for its time. The polygons here are extremely simple at best. The controls take a while to get used to, but back in its time I kind of enjoyed this one, as being able to move around in a 3D world like this fascinated me to no end. I'd play it for great lengths of time, though I'd have to put on different music as I could not listen to the game sound. The game takes up a rather small portion of the screen, unsurprisingly. It runs anywhere between 4 and 10 frames per second depending on the complexity of the scene and if there's any traffic or not. Yeah, that's right, there's two-way traffic in this game for some reason. Oh, and a flat cow that you can hit. A couple of years later, we got Race Driving from Polygames and Tangen, after Sterling Silver Software became Polygames. Polygames, because they make games with polygons. Get it? Pretty clever. At twice the memory, this is more of the same except with a couple of new tracks. In fact, the original tracks are here and it's all identical except for a bit more traffic and a different moo sound if you hit the cow. The new Super Stunt track is pretty bad as they don't render the big mountain, so it seems like you're driving on a road floating in mid-air. The problem here is that you can't often tell that the side of the road is a big cliff. The performance is mostly the same, though sometimes the frame rate can drop as low as 2 frames per second. The Genesis certainly wasn't meant to do this. There's also a cool track editor where you can design your own track and then drive around on it. Race Drive-In even came to the Super Nintendo courtesy of Imagineering and THQ. This has got to be way worse than the Genesis version with its slower CPU, right? Well, not really. For one, I appreciate the solid colors that they use here instead of the dithering that's going on in the Genesis port for some reason. Also, the big hill area actually does its best to render most of the hill, ground, and cliff. The detail is slightly less than the Genesis version, and you can see this in the thin yellow lines on the road. The frame rate varies between 5.5 frames per second at the fastest and 2 frames at the slowest, so it's not horribly worse than the Sega port. It definitely runs better than you think it would, but it certainly doesn't run great by any means. This one lacks the track editor, but it came out a year earlier, so there's that, I guess. This is Muhammad Ali heavyweight boxing on the Genesis from Virgin and Park Place Productions. For some reason, they put a lot of 3D effort into this game, and it zooms around the city and into the arena, probably because they didn't feel like putting a whole lot of effort into the actual gameplay. The game itself plays from a side view perspective, though the boxing ring is 3D and spins around a little bit. It's very slow though, and it doesn't feel all that dynamic. The gameplay itself is not very fun, but honestly, it's extremely rare for a boxing game to be enjoyable for me. Still, kudos to Park Place Productions for putting in the effort to toss in a few 3D things here and there. This is MiG-29 fighter pilot, though it says MiG-29 Fulcrum on the title screen. It's from Domark. I don't know why anyone would want to fly one of these junky Russian jets. Maybe that's why this game is so slow and uninteresting. But honestly, that can be said of pretty much any flight simulator of this time period. You have sparsely detailed environments to fly around in. They don't move fast, but then again, they don't really need to. It also uses very little screen real estate. This game would probably be improved tenfold if it had a decent music track playing, or any music at all. This is Rescue on the Genesis from Tempest and Psygnosis. Sadly, this cool game was never released. The main 2D gameplay has you flying your ship around. People are trapped all over each level and you need to rescue them, hence the name of the game. You can land and hop out of your ship in order to have each person follow you back one by one. There are many levels in each area. It's actually pretty fun. However, between each area, you need to fly to the next one. You can shoot land and air-based enemies as you do this, and it all takes place with full polygon graphics. It's a little slow and laggy, but since this is more of a bonus area, it doesn't matter a whole lot. These areas are designed so that it's still possible to fly through all the rings. The graphics and especially the music in this game are excellent, and it's too bad that it was never released in its time. Okay, now let's shift over to games that use what I affectionately like to call cheater chips, meaning that they cheat by using extra chips in the cartridge to be more impressive than the console can be on its own. It's all good though. Well, actually not all good, as a couple of these games are anything but. Anyway, let's take a look. Some games use an extra chip to push and exceed what the hardware can do on its own, like the Super Effects chip games on the Super Nintendo. The first Super Effects chip game, of course, was Star Fox by Argonaut and Nintendo. You fly around in third and first person modes and blast down enemies. This was a really big deal at the time, as most people hadn't seen graphics like these before. I remember Dave being a little more impressed than I was, but I definitely appreciated what they were doing with this game. Thanks to Nintendo's involvement, the entire experience feels very polished. It has some great music that only Nintendo could provide. The entire game takes place with massive borders around the screen so that the Super Effects chip doesn't have to draw as much. Star Fox 2 was also developed and finished, but never released. Well, not until the SNES Classic came out in 2017 anyway. I guess Nintendo felt that they'd lose less money if they didn't release it at the time. Anyway, the game changes up a lot of things, like being able to transform your R-Wing ship into a walking mech thingy. The game uses a more powerful Super Effects chip so the polygons can move around a lot faster, though it can still get kinda framey in spots. It also has that same black border around the screen. The gameplay remains solid, however, and it's worth playing any way that you can. The second game to use the FX chip was Stunt Race FX, also by Nintendo. This one is a standard but silly racer with some cool looking racetracks. The control is similar to F-Zero with the shoulder buttons to help you steer. You have a boost that you can use as long as your blue meter has some juice in it, and you can also accumulate damage indicated by the pink meter. As you drive around each track, you can collect blue thingies to get more boost and pink thingies to repair some damage. There's not only racetracks, but stunt tracks and two-player battle tracks as well. The music fits this game like a glove, and overall it's mostly an enjoyable experience. But man oh man is the frame rate slow, averaging less than 10 frames per second. Most Super Effects games run between 10 and 12 frames per second. As a result, this one can feel a little laggy, but never unplayable. I say it's worth trying if your brain is powerful enough to handle low frame rates. Then there's Dirt Track Effects by Sculptured Software and Acclaim. In this one, you ride your motocross bike around a very small arena for way too many laps each. The control and all that is actually pretty good. Also, I like the flat shaded polygonal visuals and it's fairly smooth. But ultimately, this game is a letdown. Aside from the tiny arenas and the way too many laps, the control is weird, with the X button being the confirmation button and seemingly the only way to start the game. In-game, every button is gas except for B, which is brakes. Also, the music in this one is pretty bad. It changes when you get into first place, and if you're constantly pulling ahead and falling behind an opponent, it can get very annoying. Not to mention the La Cucaracha sounding tune it plays whenever the music switches. I have no idea what they were thinking. The game's director must have never had the sound on when he was checking it. Seriously though, this could have been a fantastic title if it weren't lap-based, but as it is now, it sets new records when it comes to how fast it gets boring. Next up is Vortex by Argonaut Software and published by Electrobrain. As you may remember from a few minutes ago, Argonaut helped out with Star Fox and they thought they could hit a home run on their own. Well, not quite. You pilot a transforming mech, and the first thing you do is go through a boring space level. There's really nothing to see, so you get bored right away. A whole bunch of black empty space isn't the best way to begin a game. Free tip to any budding game designers out there. I also think the game might be too complicated for its own good. There are a lot of things that your mech can do, but unfortunately the controls are a bit convoluted. You know that's an issue when you have to use button combinations to do simple things like transform. The game also has a few collision issues like getting snagged on these tiny pyramid-shaped things that are on the ground. The graphics performance here is about the same as Star Fox, and I like the way some of the levels look. The music is great, and it's definitely my favorite aspect of this one. There are a lot of good ideas here, but in the end, I think I'd rather play Metalhead on the 32X. Too bad that one doesn't have the music from this one. Dirt Racer from Elite was only released in Europe. Yikes, I can immediately see why. This is the most unattractive Super FX game by leaps and bounds. It feels like the D-pad barely works at all, and it's easy to flip over or spin out. It honestly feels like the game is incomplete. But somehow they actually released this trash. I couldn't reach for the power button fast enough on this one. Stay away. last Super Effects enhanced game we'll look at today is something called, Doom? Yeah, I don't think I've heard of that one either. Anyway, this one was developed by Sculptured Software and published by Williams. For a 16-bit console running Doom, it's not too bad, surprisingly. Yes, it can be a little choppy here and there, and honestly it's a little too dark. But it's all still completely playable. It is missing some levels and enemies though. The sound and especially the music are really good, and overall I'd put this port a bit above the 32X version. There's not a whole lot more to say here. I mean, it's Doom, and there are many, many better versions of this game to play. The final game in this episode that uses an extra chip is Virtua Racing on the Genesis by Sega. This uses what Sega calls the SVP, or Sega Virtua processor. This chip is a bit more powerful than Nintendo's best Super Effects chip, and you can see it here. This racing game pushes more polygons than any Super Effects title and runs it all at 15 frames per second. Okay, now that's not exactly smooth, but it is a hair smoother than the Super Effects games. As a result, this game is extremely playable and responsive for the most part. The SVP even adds 2 PWM sound channels, which unfortunately didn't get used in this title. There's not much to do in this game aside from racing on 3 different tracks. Seriously, that's it. If you finish a race, you get a game over, but you do get to put in your name. If you don't finish a race, well, same thing, but no name entry for you. Well, actually, you can also put in your name if you get a fastest lap. Yes, it's extremely shallow, but at least it's fun. It's too bad that they didn't beef up the home conversion with more modes or things to do. Sega abandoned the SVP pretty fast. I mean, it cost $100 when it arrived at retail, and since customers wanted more from their games than Virtua Racing offered, it didn't exactly fly off the shelves. And since it didn't, Sega felt they didn't have much of a reason to continue developing games that used the chip. Oh well, at least we got a taste. I just want to mention Out of This World on the Genesis really quick. It's not a 3D game, which is the focus of this episode, but it does use polygon and polygon-like graphics, so it's still pushing hardware limits. Polygons are mainly used in the cutscenes and whatnot, of which there are many. The game is a cinematic platformer like Prince of Persia. I'm not sure if the actual gameplay is using polygons or simply sprites that look like polygons. There's also a Super Nintendo version of this one. This runs slower than the Genesis version, takes up less screen space, and is a touch darker. This goes for both the cutscenes and the gameplay. The Super Nintendo version also adds an exciting loading time feature. There's also a spiritual follow-up called Flashback on the Genesis. Same story here, it uses polygons for the cutscenes, but I'm pretty sure the gameplay is sprites. Of course, this one is also on the Super NES. Once again, the cutscenes are slower and darker, but they seem to take up the same amount of screen space. The gameplay is also darker, but it runs at the same speed as the Genesis game. Both of these games on both of these systems definitely have a unique look, and I like it. I know, I didn't cover every single Super Effects game. That's because Yoshi's Island and Winter Gold are definitely not 3D games. Also, I'm not including sports games like golf games in this episode, even though they use 3D polygons. There are actually a lot of these games that draw the courses using polygons, but very few of them have actual 3D movement like a flyover. I certainly think that they count, but this episode is probably already not going to get very many views, so I don't want to make it even worse. Anyway, let's finish this up with even more primitive 3D games. This is F15 Strike Eagle 2 on the Genesis from Microprose. At least now we're flying a respectable plane, and you can even shoot down MiGs pretty easily. The frame rate is slightly better than the MiG-29 game, but it's still difficult to play as it goes too far into the simulator aspect. That means it's difficult to turn around and find your targets and whatnot. But hey, at least there's music, and it's actually pretty good. In fact, it helped me keep trying this game again and again after I died, but sad to say, I was never really able to latch onto the gameplay here, and you probably won't either. Here's F22 Interceptor for the Genesis from Electronic Arts. It sure is tough to keep track of all of these Genesis flight simulators. Gameplay-wise, I had more fun with this one than any other flying games I've played so far. Anyway, this one is pretty easy to steer and otherwise control your plane and find your targets. The graphics are decent, all things considered. I like the cutaways when you take off, land, and fire a missile. This adds a little bit of fun to the visuals. I've heard a couple of people say that the 8-bit Z80 CPU inside the Genesis helps out with this game, as in it does more than just run the audio. I certainly can't say if that's true or not, or what else it could possibly be doing, but that's cool if it is actually true. And if it is, I want to know what it's doing. Speaking of the audio, this game has music. At first it's nice, but it gets old really fast. It's the only tune in the game whenever you're flying, and it's not very exciting. Oh well, as far as playability is concerned, this is the best polygonal airplane game on the Genesis. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, there's also F117 Night Storm on the Genesis from Electronic Arts. There's not much that's notable about this one except that it runs in the Genesis's lower resolution mode, which probably helps it have a smoother frame rate and feel more responsive. Otherwise, there's not much going on here that we haven't seen a dozen times in these games already.
Target destroyed.
How about Jimmy White's Whirlwind Snooker for the Genesis? Whoops, once again, I mean Mega Drive since it was only released in the PAL and CCAM regions. Here's a game I'd never expect to use polygons, but it most certainly does. It doesn't control like other pool games, but instead with an on-screen cursor. In fact, it's compatible with the mouse. It's rather tricky to get the hang of it, but there's a lot of ways to adjust your shot before you take it. As far as the graphics go, they work out great, usually running at 15 frames per second. That is pretty amazing for the Genesis running polygons all by itself. Not only that, but it uses a fairly large portion of the screen and it doesn't use the low resolution mode. There's very little in the way of audio other than some music on the title screen and some clicks and whatnot here and there. They should have beefed up that area. All in all, this is one of the more impressive games on the Genesis that attempt 3D. This is Steel Talons on the Genesis from Polygames and Tangen. It's a port of the arcade game from Atari. You control an attack helicopter and your mission in each area is always to destroy all of the targets. The control in this one is extremely awkward to say the least. When you press either left or right, the screen has a weird shift, making it very difficult to accurately control your flight. There are polygons everywhere, and the screen can update as slow as 2 frames per second, maybe slower. You heard that right, there are times when it's absolutely unplayable. Shifting into the first-person view helps the gameplay a little bit as it's less awkward, but the frame rate is still really bad. I honestly can't believe this game was released how it is. You know what's even more unbelievable is that they even made a Super Nintendo version of Steel Talons. Imagine how bad this version's gonna be with a CPU that, when maxed out, runs at only half the speed of a Genesis. Wait, this actually plays a lot better. Like, way better. Granted, the environment isn't anywhere near as detailed, it has far fewer polygons, it looks less like the arcade, and your helicopter is now a simple sprite, but man, this plays so much better. It's still choppy, running anywhere between 10 and as low as 4 frames per second, but the screen doesn't shift awkwardly if you press left or right like the Genesis version does. As a result, it's much easier to steer your copter and find the enemies to shoot down. The music here as a whole isn't as good as what's in the Genesis version, but at least the actual missions have music here. I gotta be honest, I enjoyed playing the Super Nintendo version, whereas I did not find any enjoyment in the Genesis port. If for some reason you absolutely must play this game on a 16-bit console, then I guess this is the version you need to be playing. I suppose I should mention LHX Attack Chopper on the Genesis from Electronic Arts really quick. It's another polygonal helicopter game, but honestly, it's not as good as Steel Talons. There's barely any geometry on screen, and it still runs at a crawl. You just fly around destroying targets, and the energy level is pretty low, like most of the flight games in this episode. At least the control is a bit better than the Genesis version of Steel Talons, but there's still not a whole lot going on with this one. But hey, it exists! Yay! Not to be left out, the mighty TurboGrafx-16 even has a couple of polygonal 3D games like Falcon from Spectrum Holobyte and Turbo Technologies. Yep, another flight simulator. This is the worst one yet, not only in gameplay, but presentation as well. There are barely any polygons anywhere, and you can just crash into the ground even when you're still hundreds of feet in the air. It's just awful. Do not play this one. The other game on the TurboGrafx-16 is a port of Gunboat from Accolade. You drive a boat around Vietnam in this one. The presentation is better than Falcon for sure, but it still takes place in a very small window and is very limited compared to the games on the other two consoles. They certainly didn't try pushing the TurboGrafx-16 very hard with these games. Here's Draken for the Super Nintendo from Kemco and Infogrames. This is an interesting RPG where you can create your own party if you want to. Traveling around the overworld takes place with 3D polygon graphics, though they're all completely flat. Still though, this isn't Mode 7, it's completely software rendered. It moves pretty well too, running at about 12 frames per second. It's not very detailed and only a few shapes are on the ground at any time, but hey, I'm just surprised that they didn't use Mode 7. This was a really early title on the console, but you might find something that you like here. The fighting is mostly automatic, and I like the music in this one. And let's not forget the sequel called Dragon View. This one takes place mostly with a side view. In fact, it kind of sort of reminds me of that game Exile on the Genesis and the TurboGrafx. But roaming around the overworld is exactly the same as the first game with the same performance, just with a few different colors and sprites. There's not much more to say about either of these games in this episode, but they definitely deserve a mention here. Who knew that the Super NES would even have this many titles that attempted 3D? And there you go, 3D polygonal efforts for the 16-bit console area. It's interesting to see how quickly they evolved from this generation. And I'm sure I missed some here and there, so let me know if I did so I can check them out. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. You know, being a 16-bit polygonal character gives me the urge to do one thing.
Dance!
Oh yeah, I've got to get out and show the whole world these moves. People will come for miles to see me boogie down to some saucy 16-bit tunes.